There's a moment every knitter knows. You look down at your project, something feels off and you think, should I frog this? But you keep going. But a few rounds later, the thought comes back. You ignore it again. And by that point, you're 20 rounds deeper and the answer was always yes, you should have frogged that. This is what I call the 2x rule, and it's one of 10 tips we are going to cover in this video, and I promise you some of them are things you have not heard about before. Let's get started. The 2x rule. So let's start there. The 2x rule is actually very simple. If you are questioning more than 2 times whether you should frog a project and reknit, the answer is always to frog. And I know what you're probably thinking right now, but I've invested so much time already into knitting this, and if I unravel, all this time will be gone and I've wasted it. But here's the thing. Those hours are already gone. You have already spent the time, and what you are going to do if you just, keep knitting and then the mistake is going to bother you later on is that you are wasting additional hours, because in the worst case you are creating a beautiful knitted piece that has a mistake that you know is there, and then you are less likely to wear and love the piece later on if it's something that bothers you and your gut is already telling you to go back and fix it. And knitting just takes too long for that. You are investing so much of your time into this project, your quiet moments, your slow Sunday mornings, and I think it just deserves to become something that you truly love and want to wear over and over again. I have frog projects that were 2/3 done. And I've also frogged a top that I'd been working on for weeks, where all that was left to do was weave in the ends because the fit just wasn't what I wanted. And every single time I decided to frog a project, or maybe just, think back a couple of rounds and reknit it, I was so glad that I did. That nagging feeling that you have in your head, where you have made a mistake and that you should probably go back and fix it, that's just gone immediately. And that really gives you the chance to then create something you are truly happy with and are very much looking forward to finish and wear. So give yourself permission to use this rule. 2 doubts is not being indecisive. It is listening to your gut and your instincts, and the 2x rule simply gives you a framework to, listen to your intuition more. Cast on with a larger needle. The second tip is so small that you might be wondering if this even makes a difference, and yet once you do it for the first time you will be wondering about why no one told you about it sooner. And it goes like this. If you have your knitting needle that you want to knit your project with and you are casting on, simply use a larger needle to cast on instead. So choose the green one in this example instead of the pink one. Or if you don't have the right needle at hand, you should go up like 1 or 2 needle sizes. You can also simply use 2 of the same needles to cast on. And just hold them together like this and casting on over 2 needles instead of 1. And for example, when I knit a pair of socks, this is always how I cast on. And the problem this solves is one that many knitters don't even realize exists, because when you cast on and then you start knitting, it does not become very visible at first. You, in the worst case, only start noticing it in the end when you're done, when you're trying to, let's say you've knit a sweater top down and you cast it on too tightly and then you can't really get it over your head comfortably. Or if you've knitted a pair of socks and the cast on was too tight because you knit the socks top down or cuff down, you really have to pull on the socks to get them, pull them up. And this can be so frustrating because now you've spent all the time creating the knitted object and then it's just not fitting the way you want it to. I really do this automatically now, and it's one of those habits that becomes so ingrained you stop thinking about it. You just always reach for the bigger needle, and it costs you nothing. No extra time, no extra material, just a slightly more relaxed cast on edge that will thank you for the entire life of the garment. Tip 3. Match yarn properties to your pattern, not just weight. We talk a lot about yarn weights when it comes to yarn substitutions. And the weight definitely matters because, for example, if you want to knit a pattern that calls for a DK weight yarn and you want to use an Aran weight yarn, this is going to be a bit challenging. But it's definitely doable because you can make a swatch, you can use a different needle size, you can knit a different pattern size, or just recalculate the math of the pattern. But what's much harder to compensate for, and yet I have the feeling that not so many people are talking about it, are the properties of the yarn. Whether the yarn is structured or drapey, whether it has a halo or it's spun more tightly or loosely. Those are yarn properties that are not interchangeable no matter what you do regarding, the swatching or the needle size you choose. Let's have a look at an example now. If you look at this beautiful summer top from LG Designs, you can see it is a very flowy and drapey garment, and it was actually knitted with a 100% silk yarn. And let's say you want to knit this with a 100% merino yarn like this one. I think you can already tell within the ball that this is a yarn that's going to behave very different compared to a 100% silk yarn. It's not going to be as drapey. It's not going to be as flowy. It will have a lot more structure. And that means that the garment that you are creating is going to look very different from the one in the sample pictures. It doesn't necessarily have to be bad. It can look great as well, but it's going to be different, and that's something you have to keep in mind when choosing the yarn you want to knit a certain project with. And it goes the other way too. Let's say you want to knit like maybe a cable sweater or something with a lot of texture, and you are choosing a yarn that is very drapey, or let's say something with a halo like this one. This is just going to swallow the beautiful cables and bobbles or whatever you have in the pattern, this popping of the stitches that is required when knitting something that is three-dimensional. It's just going to disappear. The yarn is simply going to swallow it. So before you fall in love with the yarn and then immediately cast on for the pattern you're currently excited about, just stop yourself and look at the pattern pictures and ask yourself, what does this garment or knitted piece need in order to look the way it does? Does it need a drapey yarn? Does it need a structured yarn? Does it need something with a halo? And, then just go from there. Tip 4, gauge swatch more. I know what you're thinking. You already know that you should swatch. But still, and I say this with complete solidarity because I've been there myself, too many of us have still just casted on a project without swatching, spent weeks knitting it, only to try it on once it's done and realizing that it doesn't fit. And that is just so frustrating. And I want to change that today. Because I think the key is not just to swatch, but to swatch in a very strategic way so that you're actually gaining useful information that will help you create a project that is truly going to fit you once you're done. The first tip I want to give you is to measure your swatch before and after blocking. And it sounds very simple and obvious, but yet many knitters just skip it. You either knit your swatch, you count your stitches, and you think, great, I've got gauge, let's go. Only to realize afterwards, once you are done and you've blocked the piece, that the gauge changed drastically during the blocking process and the garment is not fitting the way you wanted it to. Because a lot of yarns actually can change dramatically during the blocking process. They usually grow either widthwise or lengthwise or both, depending on the yarn. And yeah, this can, in the worst case, pretty much ruin your whole efforts and creating a piece that is not going to fit you. Because on the other hand, if you only measure your swatch after blocking, this could be misleading as well. Because let's say you are working with a yarn that grows a lot during the blocking process. And then you have your gauge and you start knitting. And then during the knitting process, you think, wait a minute, that looks way too small. That's never going to fit me. And then you, in the worst case, you frog the whole thing. You choose a larger size, you knit the whole thing again, it looks great on the needles, you block it, and then it grows so big that only afterwards you realize that the first size you chose would have been actually the right size for you. So, knit your swatch, measure it, block it, and then measure it again. The second thing is to recheck your gauge from time to time while you're knitting, because during the knitting process, especially if it's a large project like a garment, the gauge can change. It changes when you're relaxed versus when you're a bit tight. It can change depending whether you knit, on a sofa or sitting on a chair. It can change during one knitting session, that you're a bit tighter once you start, and then you're 1 or 2 hours in and the stitches are suddenly much more relaxed. So I wouldn't be, too scared about this and too frantically checking all the time. But, just from time to time, have a look at your stitches, see if they are still looking even, and then maybe even taking a tape measure and check your gauge from time to time. The point is that you catch it while it's still fixable, not when you're weaving in the ends and realizing that something is off. Tip 5. Use stitch markers generously. Stitch markers are one of those things where I think more is pretty much always better. I don't think I've ever finished a project and thought, wow, I used way too many stitch markers on that. And on the other hand, I do have to admit I have finished projects where I thought, wow, it would have been wiser to use more stitch markers. So the obvious use of a stitch marker is to mark the beginning of the round. I think most people probably do that already, and as well as marking increases and decreases in the pattern. But what I want to talk about specifically is using stitch markers in lace patterns, because lace can be very tricky to spot mistakes early on, especially if you're knitting, a more elaborate pattern with all over lace maybe. And then you just knit your round, and then you come to the next round and you notice that the repeat is maybe off by 1 stitch. And it can be so hard to find the mistake and then go back. You have to unravel the decreases and the yarn overs, and it's just such a pain. Whereas compared to, let's say a textured pattern or maybe a cable pattern, this is usually a lot easier to spot a mistake and then fix it. So what I would recommend when knitting lace, even if it's a more simple lace repeat like the one on the top I'm wearing today, which is, by the way, the short tee by Anne Wenzel, and you can see it has this eyelet columns and the rest is just done in stockinette, so that's a very easy repeat. But nevertheless, I still placed stitch markers, let's see, between all of the lace repeats, and I think it was only maybe a 7-stitch repeat. But still, I like to do it all the time so that I just don't get confused. And if there is a mistake in your knitting, you will be very quick to spot the one repeat where you made the mistake and then fix it. And this tip extends beyond lace too. You can use it for marking pattern repeats in color work, in textured stitches, in cables. It's always useful to break up a large number of stitches into smaller, more sizable chunks that you can easily manage. Tip 6. Check the fit and adapt freely. This might be the tip that has saved me the most finished objects over the years, and it's actually not a technique, it's just a habit. Try on your knitting constantly, more than you think you need to. I know this sounds so simple, but yet I've seen many knitters, and I definitely include myself in that, treating knitting patterns like contracts. When the pattern says to knit, I don't know, let's say for 10 inches or 25 centimeters, you just do it. You follow the pattern without thinking about it. And then in the end, when you're done, you realize that maybe the waist is cinches in at the wrong place for you, or the armhole depth is too low or not low enough, or the sleeves are too short, or whatever. Because patterns are written for an average, and there just is no such thing as an average body. The only thing that is important when you knit something for yourself is your body and your measurements, and also your preferences, of course. The knitwear designer has never met you. They can just create a pattern that fits a standard size, and then it's your job to adapt it in the way that it truly fits you. So try on your garments regularly as you knit them, or at least hold them up to your body to get a better feel if they fit. You can also use a tape measure and measure one of your favorite garments and compare it to the one you're knitting right now. So for example, for me, I have very, very long arms. And that means that if I knit a standard pattern, the sleeve length is pretty much always going to be too short for me. And for years, I just disregarded that and I knitted the pattern exactly to how it was written. And then the sleeves were slightly too short. And I told myself it was fine and it would block out, but usually it did not block out. And then I found myself either not wanting to wear the piece, or if I did wear it, I was constantly, pulling on the sleeve and trying to make it fit the way that feels comfortable for me. And that's just a waste of time. And now that I know this, I can account for this whenever I knit a long sleeve piece. I just add a couple of rounds. It takes me a couple of more minutes, but it creates a garment that truly fits me and that I like to wear over and over again. Because your handmade wardrobe should fit you, not a fictional person. The whole point of creating a handmade wardrobe is that you can create clothes that you have full control over. So don't be afraid to take the pattern and make it your own, so that you can truly create something that you love and that, is just made specifically for your body. Tip 7. Avoid rowing out. So this tip is for anyone who has ever knitted a flat piece of stockinette stitch, held it up and then realized that there are those faint horizontal ridges running all across the fabric, instead of having, like just one smooth, even piece of stockinette. And this problem has a name and it's called rowing out, and it can actually be quite annoying because no matter how hard you try to keep an even tension, it just keeps happening. Because here's what's actually going on. For most knitters, knit stitches are a bit tighter than purl stitches, because when you knit a purl stitch, the yarn has a longer path to travel, and that's why generally the knit rows are somewhat even and the purl rows are just a little bit looser. And this can be particularly annoying when you're knitting a garment where a portion of the garment is knitted flat and the other part of the garment, usually the body, from the underarms down, is knitted in the round, so it can become very visible then. I'm going to put up an example from one of my older knitting projects for you on the screen, where you can tell perfectly well how strange that looks, and that's just something that's not very wearable then. And there is a very easy way to counteract that, and I'm going to show it to you with my current knitting project, which is the Yoni. That's a summer top by Natasha Hornby. And the trick is actually very simple. I hope you can see that now. You're actually using two different needle sizes for the right and wrong side, or the knit and the purl row. So you're knitting with your main needle size for the right side, so the knit rows, and then when you're switching to the purl rows, you're using like one size down, or maybe you have to try it out and see how many needle sizes you have to go down to create, an even tension or an even looking fabric all throughout. But for me, it's always almost always one needle size, and that counteracts the issue beautifully. So I think this is one of the tips that feels almost too simple for how well it works. But whenever you're knitting flat, it doesn't have to be a garment. It can be anything like a scarf or a blanket or whatever. It definitely makes sense to check if you're rowing out and then counteract it by using two different needle sizes. Tip 8. How to pull from your yarn cake. So this is a tip that genuinely surprised me, and I learned about it more recently, and I think it's so easy to miss it because you can't really tell what the problem actually is before you know that tip. So if you look at this yarn cake, you have probably pulled from the inside before as well. Where is it? Let's see, like this. And it seems like the logical thing to do, because then you have your cake, it sits perfectly still, and you are pulling and you are, having the cake nice and neat. But here's the thing, have you ever knitted like this and then started seeing, the yarn spiraling, like almost those little corkscrews forming, and then wondering what's going on, if this is, an issue with the tension of your knitting, or maybe an issue with the yarn or whatever, and you weren't sure? So what's actually happening is this. When yarn gets created, it gets spun, and that basically means that you're adding twist to the fibers to create the structure. And when you then wind up the yarn into a cake, you wind it around a central axis. And when you pull from the inside, you unwind the yarn from the inside out. and that it means that you are influencing the twist that was originally in the yarn. And the further you pull the yarn out, the more it influences the twist, the twist or the spin. And that can really add up throughout, the whole cake. And the fix is actually very simple. It would, in these cases, be better to pull the yarn from the outside like this. So you then let the yarn, just rotate freely, because then the yarn is going to just unwind naturally while keeping its twist, and you are not influencing the spin in any way. Now, I know what some of you are thinking, but isn't the whole point of a yarn cake that I can pull from the inside out so that the yarn sits perfectly still and doesn't roll around or fall down or whatever? And yes, this can be annoying, but you could maybe place the cake into a yarn bowl, or have a lazy Kate where you put it onto so that you can roll it out. And this is then also going to prevent the cake from falling down and rolling all around, while still allowing the yarn to keep its original twist. But why does this twist issue even matter? It matters because it can affect your tension. If you are influencing the twist of the yarn, this can make the stitches look uneven, but this is also highly dependent on the yarn, so it's not going to be as visible with some of the yarns compared to others. So yarns with tooth, like woolly or sticky wool blends or multiple plied strands, naturally grab onto each other, which prevents the twist from traveling down the strand too wildly. Single ply yarns, alpaca silk or cotton, can easily untwist or overtwist because the fibers are smooth. Pulling these from the center frequently causes them to kink, distort or break. And yarns with a halo like mohair or brushed suri can grab and felt onto themselves in the center, causing massive knots. It's one of those things that once you know, you just can't unknow. So if you're dealing with a slippery, a single ply or a fuzzy yarn, just let the cake spin. Tip 9. How to get neater edges. So if you've ever found yourself knitting something flat and then looking at the edges and realizing that they are just a bit uneven and wobbly, this tip is for you, and it's actually very simple. If you start knitting a row, just skip the first stitch. That's all. That's the whole tip. But let me explain how it works, because I think understanding it makes it a lot easier to, then consistently start using it and just remembering it. So if you're knitting a stitch, any stitch basically, you are putting your needle through, you're wrapping the yarn around, you're pulling the yarn through it, and then slipping the stitch off the needle. You do that with every stitch. But the stitches that sit on the edge only have one neighbor stitch, whereas the ones in the middle have two. And that means that the risk of, just knitting the stitch slightly uneven is a lot higher, because you do not have as many neighbors to even everything out. So that means that the stitch that sits on the edge has a higher likeliness to turn out a bit larger and more wobbly. So when you slip the first stitch, the one on the edge, you are not touching it at all. And because it then spans across two rows instead of one, it becomes a bit elongated, which makes it sit a lot nicer and neater. But there are a couple of things to keep in mind. So if you are knitting a row and it's knitted in stockinette stitch, so you are knitting across the whole round, you should hold the yarn on the back of the work when you're slipping the first stitch. And when your round is a purl round, you should hold the yarn in front of the work when slipping the first stitch. And of course, you should also check the pattern, because this cannot be done with every pattern. There are, of course, patterns that require you to do something specific at the beginning of the round, and then this is not possible. Tip 10. Knit for yourself, not the trend. Now for tip number 10, I want to talk about something that is not a technique at all. It's more of a mindset thing, and it might be the most important tip of all, and that is knit for yourself, not for the trend. Now, if you are asking yourself, now what I mean by this, let me explain, because I know, of course, you're knitting for yourself. You are the one holding the needles and the yarn, you are the one knitting the piece, but what I actually mean is that if you get excited about a new pattern or a new yarn or your new colorway because you suddenly see it all over Instagram or YouTube or wherever, and you just want to be part of it, you should really step back and think for a moment and ask yourself if this is truly something that works in your everyday life, if this is a pattern style that suits you, if that is something that is going to be practical for you to wear, if that is a colorway that you like and that you can incorporate into your existing wardrobe, and if it's truly something that you want to make and you are not just getting excited because all of the hype that's currently going on. Because here is what I noticed both in my own wardrobe and in the one of other knitters as well. We spend so much time on knitting a piece for us, and if you choose to knit a pattern or choose a yarn for the wrong reasons, you end up with a garment that looks lovely, there is nothing wrong with it, but it just sits in your wardrobe and you don't wear it because you just got excited because everyone else was making it and you wanted to be part of that as well. Because as counterintuitive as it sounds, because knitting is such a slow craft, knitting trends are moving so fast. There are new patterns coming out all the time, and a silhouette that might be trending one year is maybe totally gone the next year, or a yarn colorway that is all the hype right now might not be something anyone else is going to show, in the next season. But a sweater you knit in colors that feel like you and in a shape or silhouette that suits you is one that you can wear excitedly years and years to come. So before you decide on your next project, I encourage you to have a look at your current wardrobe and see what trends you can spot there. What are the shapes you like to wear? What are the colors you are drawn to? What are maybe the necklines or the sleeve lengths? Gather as much data as possible because that is what truly matters. And also pay attention to, the climate you live in. It sounds so obvious, but I think it's so easy to get swept away and then, just wanting to cast on because you see everyone else making it. But just ask yourself, is it practical for me to knit, let's say, a wool sweater if I live in Florida? Or on the other hand, is it practical for me to knit a, very light, let's say, simple silk tee if you're knitting in a very cold place that maybe only gets warm for 1 week of the year, I don't know. Just take those things into account because your day-to-day life is what matters and not what everyone else is making right now. So this is a topic I am actually thinking about a lot, and it's also something we are constantly talking about in my online community, the Handmade Wardrobe Circle. We go through the year together there. We have a close look at our wardrobes and the pieces that we want to knit intentionally that are going to become wardrobe staples that we treasure and we wear years and years to come. We also support each other during the knitting project whenever questions come up or we just, need a little bit of encouragement. So if this is something that sounds interesting to you, I'm going to put the link in the description box so that you can check it out. So I hope this video gave you something useful to try out for your next knitting project. And if you enjoyed this video, I think you're also going to like this one here, where I talk more about my own handmade wardrobe that I have created over the last 10 years. Until next time, happy knitting, take care, bye.